So the first Mennonites to settle in North America come to Pennsylvania. The first church is established in 1683 in what's now a suburb of Philadelphia called Germantown. This building was not built in 1683. It's the new building built in the 1770s. But it's still there. You can visit the Germantown Mennonite Church today. And then other Mennonites of this kind follow, most going initially to Pennsylvania, but then scattering over a certain part of North America. So today, if you go to places like Lancaster County or Holmes County, Ohio, or northern Indiana, the sort of Elkhart, Goshen area, what you're overwhelmingly are going to run into are Mennonites of that brand. They have different last names if they're, if they are part of that tradition. And of course, many of them have different last names because they just became Mennonites recently and don't have this story of their own. And as I will try to repeat several times during this session, they are just as much Mennonites as the people who can trace this story way back in their own genetics. That doesn't, and much of what I'll talk about today is this sort of long tradition that a lot of us carry with us. That doesn't make us more Mennonites than anybody else. It doesn't make us superior. Also doesn't make us inferior, I hope. But it's different and it's true. You can't say, oh, we're just going to pretend none of that ever happened, because it did. You got to say there is this long historical tradition. It's made us act in certain ways, and it's helpful to know how that happened. And so you got to admit that it's true, even as many other things are true too, as we'll see as we go along. Yes?
When you talk about dispersion, would that almost all come out of Pennsylvania, or would it come from Europe?
Both. Certainly Mennonites who settle in Pennsylvania start moving, like Ontario was largely people for whom the American Revolution didn't seem like such a hot idea, and they had been loyalists, not because they were particularly keen on the King of England, but because they weren't convinced that going to war was a bright idea or Christian. And so a lot of them found it much more comfortable to head up to Ontario. So that would be a case of moving from an original place. Others come directly from Europe. Yeah, you're right. Good point. Now, Swiss and South German Mennonites, even by Mennonite standards, had been quite rural, quite isolated, quite separatistic. As we'll see when we talk about the Polish and Russian Mennonite traditions, they were less so. But Swiss Mennonites took this very seriously. Strong emphasis on humility, on simple living. Many wore plain clothes, probably most distinctively seen often in women's head coverings. And you can see that even within Mennonite head coverings, depending on where you came from or which particular group you were part of, they would look different. And they were often very uniform. Women didn't just pick, oh, I think I like that kind of head covering. It was like very much determined by their particular group. Men were not as unique, but there was a time, and you can see in that drawing on the right side, where men, especially ministers in that tradition, would wear what was called the plain coat. It was a coat without lapels. You did not wear a tie. It's actually not a style of clothing that goes way back in Mennonite tradition. They actually pick it up and adopt it from other groups. Anyway, it's complicated. But the point is, at certain points in their history, this sort of thing was very important. It's a visible marker that we are different from the rest of the world. And of course, the Swiss tradition is the one that gives us the Old Order Amish. So you can tell, yeah, they really do have an inclination for that kind of thing. The Old Order Amish being the most extreme, but other groups, and there's this unbelievably complicated spectrum between sort of the most acculturated Swiss Mennonites and the Old Order Amish. There's all these other groups that somehow fit themselves into that spectrum somewhere. And we will not get into how that all works. Most of these immigrants would divide themselves up when they got here, Because again, when they come here, there's not really this strong sense of denominational structure that we think of today. You didn't have, a denominational headquarters somewhere and bureaucrats and offices and committees and commissions. You just had this sort of sense that we're a people. And that was usually defined regionally. So you'd have the Lancaster Conference or the Franconia Conference, which is Eastern Pennsylvania, or the Allegheny Conference or the Ohio Conference, et cetera. Not a real sense of denomination, of national denominational identity to begin with. Now that over time changes. During the 19th century, you see a lot of religious groups starting to shape more of a structure. They're becoming institutions in a way that they hadn't been before. And Mennonites do that too. So a lot of these regional groups out of the Swiss tradition decide that they've got something in common and it would make sense to kind of link themselves together nationally. And so this group meets as a general conference for the first time in 1898. Now, here's where things get confusing. These people meeting in 1898 as the General Conference are not the General Conference Mennonites. Stay with me, I'll explain it. This is a group that came to be known as the Mennonite Church most often, which some people think is a little presumptuous, what makes them the Mennonite Church. On the other hand, in North America, they are sort of the one group that doesn't have a splintering at the beginning of their story. We just kind of always were. We were Mennonites back in Switzerland, and then we moved to the Palatinate, and then we moved to Pennsylvania. We never broke off from anybody, well, except the Catholics, as opposed to virtually every other Mennonite group who at some point, when they go back to their birth narrative, they split off from somebody. So, maybe it made sense for them to call themselves the Mennonite Church. But people did split off from them. So, in the 1840s, there is a splinter movement in Eastern Pennsylvania, a group led by a minister named John Oberholzer. They start to adopt various progressive ideas and programs in Eastern Pennsylvania. So these are part of what we now call the Mennonite Church. So they would have argued that, the ministers really shouldn't have to dress uniquely. That's kind of, it's like, what's that all about? We should be engaged in more evangelistic kind of programs, which within a lot of the Mennonite world was held in suspicion. Those feel like sort of aggressive, pushy kind of American things, and that's not how we do things. But these people were saying maybe we should. Or they said we really ought to run our meetings with more proper procedure. If we're going to be an organization, we ought to have constitutions. We ought to have bylaws. We ought to keep minutes of our meetings so that we can go back and look to see what it was we agreed to. And of course, from our point of view, we think, really? They split over that? That's wacky. Those people were silly. Except they really weren't when you start to think about what's at stake here. The conservatives would have said, our word isn't good enough for each other. We can't look each other in the eyes and agree to something and all walk away knowing what it was we agreed to. You trust me so little that you're going to write it down? So it very much is a sort of pre-modern versus modern divide, as it were, between these kind of things that today we take for granted. I mean, most of us would say writing stuff down, that protects us all. Anyway, these two groups did not see eye to eye, and they split in Eastern Pennsylvania. The new group in 1847 becomes the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference of the Mennonite Church. Informally, they came to be known as the New Mennonites. And of course, by extension then, the people who didn't join this group became the Old Mennonites. New Mennonites didn't stick. Old Mennonites did. A lot of us probably who grown up in this world might remember hearing about this group called the Old Mennonites. There's never been a group that is actually called that, but the Mennonite Church sort of informally was. New Mennonite ideas took root Other regional conferences shared their modern ideas, and in 1860, just by coincidence, the same year that the Mennonite Brethren get their start in Russia, it's just a coincidence. In 1860, several of these like-minded Swiss and South German progressive groups come together in Iowa to form the General Conference of the Mennonite Church of North America, which they would later shorten to General Conference Mennonite Church. And so then in 1898, when the Mennonite Church decides finally to get around to start organizing things and becomes the Mennonite Church General Conference, you've now got a Mennonite Church General Conference and you've got a General Conference Mennonite Church. And to make matters worse, when the Mennonite Brethren get here in a few years, we'll talk about that in a minute, and decide to form a binational conference between all churches in the US and Canada, what do they call it? The General Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches of North America. So the three largest Mennonite churches in North America all use the term General Conference somehow to define who they are. And if this isn't confusing, I don't know what is. So General Conference Mennonites were generally the most ecumenical of all the Mennonite groups. They tended to emphasize unity and merger rather than separation and splitting. They were the most likely to take on the trappings of mainline Protestantism, fancy buildings and pipe organs. Now, given that they are a big tent sort of group, there's considerable diversity in the General Conference. And so they span the spectrum, for instance, from very conservative fundamentalism to very progressive, liberalism, for lack of a better word. But as a rule, other Mennonites tended to view the General Conference as the worldly ones. So when I grew up, what I knew to be true, and I grew up in a town with 3 Mennonite churches, General Conference, Mennonite Brethren, and the one I attended, which was Evangelical Mennonite Brethren, a different group that we have not talked about yet and we will not talk about again. But I knew this to be true. General Conference Mennonites are the ones who danced, smoked, and drank, and didn't believe in salvation. And the Old Mennonites, who we didn't have in town, but they were in other towns nearby, they were the ones who dressed funny. So that was pretty much what I needed to know. I'm not quite sure what they said about us. How's that? The pious ones, yes. The ones who think they're holier than the rest of us. And so anyway, we've now got Mennonite Church, and we've got General Conference Mennonites, the MCs and the GCs. So if you ever hear those terms, and people still throw those terms around, for those of you who don't know that thing, MCs, what's that? Okay, that's the old Mennonite Church. GCs, those are the General Conference Mennonites. And then, of course, we haven't gotten them to North America yet, but we will here in a moment. MBs, that would be the Mennonite Brethren. Speaking of which, yes. Yep.
Only recently did the Swiss become Mennonites. That is the Mennonite Church in Switzerland itself. Do you know when these Mennonites that came to North America started using that term?
Sorry. I think they would have, Swiss Mennonites would have been calling themselves Mennonites by the time they got here to North America. That's my impression, at least.
But you don't know when that.
No, I don't know exactly.
We're informally Mennonites, but that title is recent.
Right. They would more likely probably have used terms like Täufer, which just means Baptist. And of course, as I mentioned last week, I think the Dutch Mennonites to this day don't call themselves Mennonites. All right, the next major wave of Mennonites getting to North America occurs in the 1870s. And this time, it's not Swiss and South German Mennonites, it's the ones who were living in Russia. And I didn't show you a map last time, but here's a map of where the Mennonites were living in Ukraine and Russia. Do I have a pointer on this thing? Yes, I do. But it doesn't show on the white screen. So there's the Malachna colony just above the Sea of Azov and the Khortytsa colony up by the present-day city of Zaporozhye. Those were the two original colonies where Mennonites were living, and then we'll talk about the fact that all those other little splotchy marks appear later. But in the 1870s, about a third of the Mennonites in Russia decided that they needed to leave. So that's about 18,000 of them, give or take. They did so because the Russian government is starting to change its policies. It's starting to change its policies on the special privileges that it had granted to not just Mennonites, but all kinds of people. Remember, Catherine the Great invited all these Mennonites to come and said, you won't have to serve in the military. You can run your own schools. You can more or less run your local governments with essentially no interference, or not much interference, at least from the Russians. Just be quiet. Don't proselytize, don't make trouble, do your own thing. Now Russia's starting to rethink that. They're trying to modernize themselves as a nation state, more like other Western European governments. This whole idea of special privileges is kind of a problem. Why should some people not have to serve in the military when others do? Why should you, who have now been living here for quite a few decades, still be thinking of yourselves as other than Russia? It's time to start being Russian. And not all Mennonites were willing to do that. Those who chose to leave Russia at this time generally were the most culturally, the most religiously conservative, the least willing to accommodate to changes like this. Now, in other cases, you might have also been the Mennonites who were the least likely to have land. And that was becoming a real problem in Russia at this time. Because the way the system worked in terms of land is the government set up these colonies. So I mentioned Malachna and Khortytsa as the first two. And the government said, this land is for Mennonites. And now individuals can buy land within that colony, but they can't just run around and buy land wherever they want to. And so there is definitely a limit to how much land is available. And the Mennonite population is growing. It's outstripping the amount of land. So many who wanted it couldn't get it. That's a financial problem. It's also a political problem because the system was set up that the people to really have a political voice within these Mennonite colonies were the landowners. So if you didn't have land, you were at a disadvantage at several levels. And so as these stirrings about migrating come up, Mennonites without land were kind of disproportionately inclined to think, this sounds like a good idea, because we hear there's lots of it over there on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, there were wealthy Mennonites who did own land who moved. There were poorer Mennonites who didn't own land who didn't move. So this is not an absolute thing, but the tendency was there. Now, eventually, daughter colonies would be created in Russia. So I mentioned Khortytsa and Malachna, but then scattered across this map are those little dark spots. Those are all what were called daughter colonies that were subsequently set up to take the pressure off this disconnect between population and land availability. So that helps, but it wasn't good enough to stop a lot of these people from moving. All Mennonite groups in Russia at the time, including the Hutterites, who were different but do trace their history back to the Anabaptists, all of them were involved in this decision to migrate. So roughly a third each from, for lack of a better word, we'll call it the mainline Mennonite Church in Russia, and roughly a third of the Mennonite Brethren decided we're going to leave. Now, if you were part of the more conservative groups, remember we mentioned the Kleingemeinde last week, the really conservative ones in Russia, 100% of them left in the 1870s. Not a single one stayed behind. Another group that we didn't mention last week, the Crimmer Mennonite Brethren, Crimmer meaning Crimea in German, they also left entirely. Not a single one left behind. Now, in terms of our church's history, for those of us who have ancestors who were part of this whole big story, virtually all of us, our families came out in the 1870s. A couple of exceptions. Al and Ann would be an exception. I believe your families came out after the 1920s. Ken Neufeld would be an exception. But the fact that I can just pick out a couple, there aren't many others in the room. We are mostly part of that group that said when these changes start coming down, we're getting out of here. And where are we going to go? Well, we're going to go to these places. So the yellow pins show the areas where Mennonites who left Russia in the 1870s went. And it's, more or less in the big picture of things, a pretty straight line running down the 98th parallel, which is where the agricultural frontier of Canada and the United States was in the 1870s. Southern Manitoba, southern Minnesota, Mountain Lake, southeastern South Dakota, Freeman, York County, Nebraska, that's Henderson, Jefferson and Gage counties in Nebraska, that would be Jansen, Nebraska, central Kansas, Hillsboro, North Newton, Buhler, those places. And that was, everyone who came settled in those handfuls of areas. Now you might say, well, what about Oklahoma? Well, that comes later. What about, being ahead of ourselves. We'll get there in a moment. So this is where the Mennonites who decide to leave in the 1870s come. So they are somewhat removed from the Swiss and South German Mennonites who are back east. So they don't immediately start interacting in all kinds of ways. They're speaking different languages. They're still living in different places. They still think of themselves very much as different people. Now, 2/3 of the Mennonites stayed in Russia during the 1870s, and they found ways to live with the new policies. For instance, they negotiated a system of alternative service so that their boys would not have to serve in the military. They went into forestry service often, planted trees and stuff like that. And they were generally more comfortable with the idea that a little bit of acculturation isn't so bad. And also, things are really good here. Why would we want to leave? Speaking of things being really good here, many Mennonites in Russia after the 1870s became really wealthy and really influential. So on the right, that's the Abraham Bergman estate there. And it's not a bad piece of real estate from what we can tell in that picture. The gardens are certainly quite something. Or on the left, it's a little hard to tell what all's going on there, but that is a really big agricultural implement factory, the Lepp and Wallman factory in the Kortitsa colony. These people became movers and shakers. They were politically influential. There were Mennonites serving in the Russian Duma. They were the economic engine of Ukraine. Maybe not the only one, but they were one of the very major ones. These people were doing well. They often thought of themselves as more sophisticated than those, country bumpkins who all decided to leave in the 1870s, the ones like us. Maybe not being entirely fair there, but there was some of that dynamic going on. But this golden age was not to last. It came crashing down. World War I, followed by the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists take over, the creation of the Soviet Union. Civil war breaks out in the Ukraine between the communist forces, between the forces still loyal to the Tsar and anarchist armies. So you've got three armies basically rolling back and forth through the Mennonite colonies during this time. It was horrible. Widespread famine. And then after that, decades of Stalinist oppression. I mean, this is a horrible story. And it's one that most of us, again, with a handful of exceptions, isn't part of our story because our families mostly left before this time. So not surprisingly, a lot of these Mennonites are looking for ways to leave now. They can't come to the United States, or at least very few of them do. The United States was going through in the 1920s one of its periodic hysterias about immigrants. We all know about these, and had placed very stringent quotas on immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe especially. So the United States was basically closed to these Mennonites. That's why we don't have terribly many of these 1920s and 30s and 40s immigrants living here, unless they've decided to move later, like a few of us have. Instead, they went to one of three primary countries: Canada, that would be the main one, but then also Paraguay and Brazil. Those were the places where they could find places that would let them live. Paraguay had this really lovely part of the country that was known as the Green Hell, the Chaco, and they said, sure, you can go live there. And I mean, those Mennonites really did have to eke a living out of nothing. It's now one of the major economic engines in Paraguay, but that's another story. So multiple waves now in the 20s and the 30s, and then again following World War II, migrate into those other three countries. It's an interesting, as is often the case with the immigrant groups, even when you come from the same place and you're the same people, when you come in different waves, you're probably different because you chose to leave at different times, and then your development is different after that. And when you get back together, it's like, who are you? And we're not sure we like you much because you're not the same as us anymore. And there's been some of that has happened within the immigrants from Russia story. Canada and the United States Mennonites who come from Russia often do seem a tiny bit different. We won't get into all the details of that. But it's sort of an inevitable process. Now, not all Mennonites were able or chose to leave the Soviet Union during this era. Most of them living in the Ukraine were forcibly relocated out of the Ukraine. Stalin basically put them on train cars, headed those trains east, and at some point stopped the train and told everyone to get off and fend for yourself. Most of them ended up in places like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan during the 1940s, created new lives for themselves there. Many of them would later emigrate to Germany as Soviet restrictions eased, and then as the Soviet Union ceased to exist in the late 20th century. Anyway, back to North America. So during both the 1870s and then again 1920s and after waves of migration, if you were a Russian Mennonite, so not Mennonite Brethren or one of those other splinter groups, and you got to North America, you mostly decided to join the General Conference Mennonite Church. They, of course, so these are Swiss and South German Mennonites, and this Russian influx joining them, which is a new sort of thing in the world. That hadn't ever happened before, that people from those two cultural traditions would merge. But keep in mind, the General Conference, they were the big tent, let's all join together sort of brand of Mennonites. And so they welcomed this idea. Now, so if you were Mennonite Brethren, you were still feeling the sting of not having been treated very well in Russia by those other Mennonites. And so in Mennonite Brethren self-understanding, the General Conference Mennonites became the new group for us to transfer that animosity to. In fact, you'll even sometimes hear people say, oh yeah, Mennonite Brethren, we split off from the General Conference. Like, well, no, not exactly, because there wasn't such a thing in Russia in the sense that we have it in North America, but it's an understandable mistake that you might make. Okay, moving along here. So Mennonites in North America by the early 20th century, they're still largely a Germanic people. They are still mostly speaking German. They are still very much of an immigrant people. Not necessarily because they thought themselves better than everyone else, but largely because all those other people scared them to death. I mean, it's the classic sort of immigrant story. You keep the rest of the world at bay because you're afraid of it. Don't let your children date those other people because you'll lose your children if that happens. That outside world is powerful. It has the potential to corrode us. So Mennonites were, it takes a long time for them to switch to being an English-speaking church. Swiss Mennonites were already making the switch by the late 19th century. They had been here a lot longer. It wouldn't happen for most 1870s immigrants until the time of World War II. How many of us remember going to church where German was what was preached? So certainly the Canadians. Most of the rest of you, not so much. That would have changed in the 1940s. In Canada, it wouldn't have changed until when? 60s? Yeah, 1960s, sometimes even the 70s. Conference proceedings, when they get together, you know, the book they print up later with all the proceedings, it's in German, maybe with a little English section for the people who were starting to make that switch. That phenomenon is quite recent. I mean, even for us, the 1940s, not that long ago. Okay, by the 20th century, you've got sort of the big three of the Mennonite world being the MCs, the Old Mennonites, the General Conference Mennonites, who have now become this interesting amalgamation of Swiss, South German, and Russian immigrant Mennonites. So MCs, pretty much all Swiss, South German, GCs, this combination, and then Mennonite Brethren being virtually entirely made up of people who had migrated from Russia and not yet ready to invite other people in. You know, was that because they felt superior to them? Well, maybe at our worst we did, but more likely we felt threatened by them. And so we didn't know what to do with those people. You sort of, you know, and Mennonite Brethren especially are starting to get this sense we ought to spread the gospel, but that would mean they'd want to come to our church. Well, they don't speak our language, and they're different from us, and you know, that was scary. And it's classic sort of immigrant group experience. And it's easy to kind of think, oh, that was wrong. We shouldn't have acted that way. And you can probably say that about us now because, yeah, by now we have adapted enough that we ought to know better. But for most of those groups in the past, I don't think it's really fair to think of them that way because it was scary. You don't want, you know, cling to that language because it's the way that your faith tradition is most purely communicated to yourself, you know, so hang on to those things. It's survival. Those are life rafts. Now, I should also note, in addition to those big three, the MCs, the GCs, and the MBs, we often forget the other biggest group, Old Order Amish. And today, the group that's growing the fastest, it's all of those old order groups. The Amish are growing way faster than other mainstream Mennonite groups. And they don't evangelize. They don't invite anybody to come join them. So how do they do it? Their kids stay put. Our kids tend not to. But if you can't evangelize your kids, who can you evangelize, for goodness sake? Anyway, that's an aside. Moving along here. So at some point in the late 20th century, we start to see an interesting phenomenon that is very much relevant to us now as we're thinking about possibly, most likely, joining this group that we hear called the MCUSA. Well, where did it come from? Beginning in the late 20th century, groups within the Mennonite Church and the General Conference begin to explore the possibility of merging. Of those two, the GCs had always supported this idea. You know, we're ready, we'll merge. Mennonite Church, not quite as enthusiastic, but growing sense of enthusiasm. In the 1950s, the two groups start cooperating in their seminary programs. The General Conference Mennonites had a seminary in Chicago, which then they moved to Elkhart, Indiana. The Mennonite Church had a seminary in Goshen, Indiana, just a stone's throw away from Elkhart. And the two start to cooperate in the late 1950s. They move on to the same campus in Elkhart in 1969. They come to be known as the Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminaries, plural, and then formerly merge into one seminary in the early 1990s, the Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary. Today, because they wanted to keep that AMBS thing, I guess, they're known as the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, still located in Elkhart. And of course, once you merge your seminaries, you're well on your way to creating more of a common sense of who you are, because that's presumably where your ministers are being trained and other church functionaries. MC and GC began holding joint assemblies in 1983, did that for about 12 years, and then they vote to merge in 1995. And then it takes a while to dot the I's and cross the T's when you do this sort of thing. And so that process was fully completed in 2002. And we have this thing called the Mennonite Church USA. It was the greatest example of Mennonite denominational unity ever seen. There's not much precedent for this kind of thing happening. It also ironically led to new fractures that hadn't existed before. So both the MCs and the GCs prior to this had been united across the US-Canadian border. There was the General Conference Mennonite Church, which included both Canadian and United States regional districts. The MCs, who were overwhelmingly in the United States, but did have Canadian churches as well, also united across the border. So when they merged in 2002, to the surprise of some, they split in the other direction. MC USA and MC Canada are now different denominations. They're closely linked to each other. They share considerable, identity with each other, but structurally, they are different, which not everyone saw coming, especially in the MC church, because they were almost all in the United States, and Canada was kind of this weird exception. Beyond that, since the merger, most of the very religiously conservative regional conferences have withdrawn from Mennonite Church USA over issues that would be very familiar to all of us: women in leadership, interpretation of scripture. What do we do about LGBTQ people who want to be part of the church? The groups that were more conservative on almost all those issues have either chose not to join this merger or since that time have pulled away. Even huge groups like Lancaster Mennonite Conference are not part of MC USA now, largely because of this issue. So in 1998, when the two groups merged, their membership was about 133,000. In 2021, 62,000. Now, we said, where did all those people go? Well, they're still Mennonites. They've just become part of other groups of Mennonites. So it's an ironic situation. This, finally we see these fractious, squabbling Mennonites decide to come together. It's like, this is great. Oops, there they go. They break apart on other planes. Now, like most religious denominations today, Mennonite membership is generally fairly stagnant, or, in this case, even declining, but it's declining because, structural divisions have changed. I already mentioned there's, the main exception to this trend are the Old Order Amish and other Old Order Mennonite groups that are growing quite rapidly. No one saw that one coming. Okay, so moving along here. I've hinted at it. I've already talked about us as an immigrant group that sees itself as very different from the rest of the world, which raises, now we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, ethno-religious aspects of being Mennonite, whether you like it or not. And the early Anabaptists most certainly wouldn't have liked it. I think Anabaptist martyrs everywhere are rolling in their graves at the idea that Mennonites became an ethno-religious group. An idea that you could somehow be Mennonite regardless of your own decision about whether you wanted to be or not, that somehow that was still part of your identity. It's like, that is not, what we went to the stake and were drowned and, otherwise treated badly. That's not what we did that for. And yet here we are. How did that happen? And of course, it didn't break into one ethno-religious tradition. There were various ones. The Swiss and South German had their version. So you go back to the eastern part of the United States and you run into Yoders and Wengers and Burkholders and names like that. And they're eating things like Shufi pie and vaguely remember that their ancestors, spoke Pennsylvania Dutch. Or you go to the Midwest or places like this out here, and you run into these Mennonites who trace their history back to Poland and Russia, and their names Wiebe and Friesen and Rempel, and other names that you don't run into just every day. And they're eating Zwieback and Verenica and doing other ethnic things. Or this third group that I keep mentioning but say very little about, the Hutterites. You've got Hofers and Cheddars and Kleinsassers, and they're really related to each other because they were a tiny little group that was very separatist. So each of those traditions develop independently. They've had limited intermarriage between themselves, though it has certainly happened. Stan and Dolores Friesen would be an example of someone from the Swiss tradition, Dolores, marrying someone from the Russian tradition, Stan. So it happens, but not that often. So how did this happen? It clearly violated early Anabaptist ideas about church membership and what it meant to become part of a church. So what's going on? I think it was driven both by the ways Anabaptists and Mennonites were treated and also their own theological self-understanding. So remember, we talked last week, these people are persecuted. They are treated badly. They chose to start to live apart and distinctively from the larger society. And they chose to move. So now they're taking their self-understanding, their language, other such things to other places where they're even more different than everyone around them now. They very quickly start to develop a sense of being not just religiously unique, but culturally unique. And the fact that they're speaking, languages like Pennsylvania Dutch or Plotdietsch made it easier to maintain separation. Beyond that, I mentioned last week this idea of a two-kingdom theology. There's the kingdom of the world, and there's the kingdom of God. And as much as possible, those two things are different. So it's not just that they're treating us badly, but our own theology tells us we should be separate. We should be different. We shouldn't interact too freely. And both of those realities coming together, I think, have made it the case that Mennonites, for much of their history, understood themselves as a people separate from the larger populations around them. They expressed their faith differently, but they also spoke a different language. They ate different foods. They had different customs and rituals, and they limited the amount of interaction between themselves and the world. Now, if you're going to be separate from the world, one of the best ways to do that is choose your marriage partners carefully. Marriage outside the Mennonite Church in most groups would have been cause for excommunication throughout most of our history. If you want to be a part of the church, you'll marry another person who's part of the church. And they've got to be baptized. They can't just attend. You've got to be a member. Even marriages between different branches of Mennonites tended to be frowned upon, maybe not forbidden, though in some groups they would have been, but certainly frowned upon. This would raise eyebrows if a Mennonite brethren married a general conference like Connie's parents, or my parents, EMB and MB. It's like, whoa, how's that supposed to work? And in more conservative groups, like the Kleine Gemeinde, for instance, that conservative Russian group, outside marriage, absolutely forbidden. Now, keep in mind, those groups have only a few thousand members total of any age. Now, find yourself a marriage partner. And keep in mind that you've been doing this now for several generations. Those marriage partners are going to be your relatives. Talked with my grandma Enns-Rempel once about this, who grew up Kleine Gemeinde. Oh, there were nothing but other cousins to choose from. We had no choice. That's the way it was. You married your cousins. And And so the frequency of close relative marriage becomes extremely high and just reinforces this ethno-religious thing. Most of us in this room are descended from roughly 10,000 Mennonites, give or take a few, who migrated from Poland to Russia in the late 18th or early 19th century. That's not a very big group to all be descended from. And then we keep marrying each other until quite recently. So it's safe to say that everyone who has Mennonite ancestors who migrated from Poland to Russia is in fact related to everyone else who can also say that. It might not be first cousins, might not even be second cousins, but somewhere along the line, it's there. We have researched this phenomenon extensively. Some of you have probably heard or used the Grandma Genealogy Project, the Genealogical Registry and Database of Mennonite Ancestry. And yes, I know registry and database is redundant, but when you're looking for an acronym like grandma to name your genealogy project, you throw in different words if you have to. It now contains information on almost 1.5 million people, not who are Mennonite, and I think this is an important distinction, but people who have ancestors who were Mennonites in Poland or Russia. That's what this project's studying. It is not trying to determine who are real Mennonites and who are otherwise, but it's acknowledging this thing happened. And it's interesting to see how it's changed now over time. Anyway, I decided to go into Grandma and do one of the cool things it can do, which is calculate the relationships between any two people in the database. Here are ways in which I am related to y'all. This is page 1. There's a second page. I've ranked them in terms of who's the closest related to me and then how many different ways each of us are related to each other. So Nancy Becker and I apparently take the prize in this particular chart. We are second cousins once removed, and we are related 12 different ways to each other. Just by coincidence, I'm also a second cousin to Nancy's husband, Dennis, but through a completely different line. For Nancy, it's Friesens. And Nancy was also Kleingemeinde, hence the 12 different ways of being related. This really is a freak show. I mean, I'm going to just admit that right off the bat. To make matters worse, I am related to a guy named Kevin Enns-Rempel. I am his third cousin once removed, which is what happens when Grandpa Rempel marries the daughter of his first cousin, John Clausen, in Dallas, or in Meade, Kansas. They hadn't gotten to Dallas yet. And so he's married his first cousin once removed, making Grandma and my dad second cousins, making my dad and me third cousins, making me my own third cousin once removed, and five ways we're related altogether. Oh, Connie Enns-Rempel's on the list too. We're fourth cousins twice removed. And then there's a second page where it continues on here. So these were all the different relationships. Now, okay, sixth cousin, that's pretty distant. Most of you probably had no idea you were a cousin of mine of some sort or another. But even if you don't know it, you start to realize, oh, wow, there really is this weird intertwined thing that just kind of, it's just there. And it has played itself out in really strange sort of ways. No, I didn't make a chart, but I did another thing where I decided to check every married couple in church to see who was the closest related. I'll out a few people here. Delbert and Marge get the prize. They're fourth cousins. But I think Nathan and Rachel Bolt need to get a special commendation. They may only be seventh cousins once removed, but they are related in 17 different ways that we can document. And they're just kids. So good job, Nathan. You're keeping the tradition alive. It's like, oh my gosh. So to be Mennonite historically has really had three different things it can mean. It can mean I'm a member of a Mennonite church. I joined last Sunday and my parents were, and all my other ancestors were something totally different, but I am now a Mennonite. And just for the record, that is the best definition of them all. That's really all that needs to be said. I'm part of a Mennonite church, therefore I am a real Mennonite. But the reality is there are other things that people think too when they say that. For many of us, it's both a religious and a cultural identity. We had the Mennonite grandmas. We had the Mennonite great-grandpas. We have these foods that most other people don't think are terribly impressive, but they touch our hearts deeply. I mean, zwieback, really, honestly, it's not the most thrilling ethnic food ever created, but, you know, do we all love them? Yes. Other people don't always understand, and I get that. So for us, it's both. And then for other people might say, well, I'm an atheist or I'm Buddhist now, but I still think of myself as being Mennonite because that thing is part of my story. So when someone says I'm a Mennonite, you kind of have to scratch under the surface to figure out what that's all about. So if I didn't make it clear enough before, let me just say here right now that every one of you who has joined a Mennonite church, regardless of how you got here and regardless of how your ancestors behaved, are real Mennonites. Because we haven't always done that. We've used this reality badly in many cases. We've held people at arm's length because they weren't real Mennonites. They didn't have the right last name. They couldn't answer in a meaningful way the question, oh, who were your grandparents? And we have behaved badly. At one point, I think it was understandable self-preservation and protecting ourselves from a big, bad, scary world. But at some point, it stopped being that and just became bad behavior. So I apologize for any time I've ever done that, and I apologize for all the rest of the times that we have, in fact, done it. If you're part of a Mennonite church, regardless of how you got here, you're real. The ancestral line is not what matters. On the other hand, I spend time talking about it because we can't ignore it. It's real. And when new people come into the church, they kind of have to be clued in that, okay, there's this weird thing going on here, and, you know, we'll try to laugh at it as much as possible. But it's real. It's been the glue that's held us together. It's given us strength at times when life was hard, but it's also been something we've used badly. And having said that, most Mennonites in the world would say, wait, what? That's not my story. Because these are all real Mennonites too. And these aren't just random pictures of people from other parts of the world. They really are Mennonites. They are Mennonites singing in Congo in the upper left. They are Mennonite, apparently all men, delegates at the Conference of Mennonites in Ethiopia, which is one of the largest populations of Mennonites in the world. Or down the lower left, they are Mennonites in India. And you can't see him from a distance, but in about the third row, almost on the left, is our own Werner Croaker, not a Mennonite from India, but who spent a lot of time there, as many of us are aware, and had many relationships with people in India. These are all real Mennonites, and not a one of them, except for Werner, had any ancestors who came from places like Poland and Russia. They became Mennonites because missionaries went out beginning in the late 19th century. Many Protestant denominations start to do these mission programs. Mennonites are part of them, and many of them are very successful. So today, countries with the largest Mennonite memberships, all Mennonites on the left, Mennonite Brethren on the right. So the United States has more Mennonites than any other country, but in second is Ethiopia. Third is India. Fourth is Congo. Canada comes in a distant fifth. And then the other countries after that in the top 10 are mostly countries that you wouldn't expect. And the Mennonite Brethren are even more dramatic. Canada and the United States come in fourth and fifth, behind India, Congo, Laos, and Thailand. And then the ones who come behind that, Angola, Malawi, Brazil, and Canada are largely those Plautdietsch Mennonites. But the majority of Mennonites in the world today aren't that thing. And we have to remember that. And we have to figure out what that means. Again, are we the real Mennonites? Are they the exceptions? We have to be very careful as we try to navigate those sort of things. All right, we're getting very close to 12, so we better wrap this sort of thing up. Just a little bit in terms of the acronyms that we tend to throw around way too casually here. And for those of us who do that, I would, don't do that without defining what they are. Don't throw out a term like MCC thinking, oh, everyone knows what that means. We need to be careful about that sort of thing. But some of the acronyms we hear most often, MB, of course, that means Mennonite Brethren Church. And then it's got other subgroups like ICOM. I'm sure some of you have probably heard ICOM and probably can't tell me what it stands for. It's the International Community of Mennonite Brethren. So it's in which representatives from all those different countries and others that were on that list get together and think about what it means to be Mennonite Brethren in a global sense. PDC, that's the reference to the Pacific District Conference, which is our particular regional group of Mennonite Brethren. USMB, that would be United States Mennonite Brethren. Then we've also mentioned, like, we've got the GCs, who don't exist anymore, but we still talk about them. That's General Conference Mennonite Church, MC, Mennonite Church, and now we've got MC USA, MC Canada. And then there are these organizations that we've created. We hear a lot around here about MCC, Mennonite Central Committee, which was a group, and the reason they called it that is in the 1920s, Mennonites were trying to help Mennonite refugees in Ukraine. And there were lots of little regional groups trying to do this, and they decided it would be more efficient if we pulled those all together into a Mennonite Central Committee. And that's why we have that sort of odd name. Where did it come from? And today, MCC is the leading Mennonite organization providing relief and reconciliation sort of work around the world in all sorts of different ways. MDS, Mennonite Disaster Service, cleans up after things go wrong in various sorts of ways in the world. Peggy has done lots of work with them. Others in the past, Gordon Weens would be an example, but Peggy's our current MDS stalwart. Thank you for what you do with that organization, who do remarkable work in terms of not just showing up right after the disaster and handing out a few bags of things and then leaving, but actually sticking around for the long haul and cleaning things up and building new buildings and I think have, in many parts of the country where there aren't many Mennonites, but there are lots of tornadoes and floods, when those people think of Mennonites, they think, oh, those are the people who actually came and stuck around and helped. And that means a lot. So MDS, I think, has done great work. MWC, Mennonite World Conference, that's not another denomination. It's not like MB or MCUSA. It's all those different groups getting together periodically to sort of think about what does it mean to be Mennonite again in that global sort of sense with these different stories, some of us tracing them all the way back to the 16th century, some of us back to missionaries who came in the 19th century, some of us who just joined last week. What does that mean to be Mennonites in that global sort of sense? There are lots of other acronyms, but probably we don't need to go into all of them, and my clock tells me that it's 12:01 anyhow. So there you have it, the helter-skelter, pell-mell race through Anabaptist Mennonite history in 2 short weeks. Any questions? Roger.
Would you be able to spend another hour talking about our relationship with American Indians, Native Americans, and also with peace churches, the Quakers and
I'd have to do a bunch of research to be able to do it, but I mean, certainly it would be possible for someone to talk about all those things sometime. I know less about those stories than I do about this kind of broad overview, but yeah, there are those ways of thinking about those stories too, yeah. I'm not going to do it next week, but anyway. Yeah. And at some point I had intended to put that into my notes and then I forgot, so thanks. Another phenomenon in this story today are groups that are not historically Mennonite, and yet who are starting to think of themselves as being Anabaptist. So they might come out of, high church, Episcopal traditions, other Protestant traditions, and would mostly say, Mennonite seems to be too tied up with that whole weird ethnic thing, and that's not who we are. And yet the Anabaptist part of that story really does resonate with who we are. So Stuart Murray, for instance, out of England, wrote a book called The Naked Anabaptist, which does not refer to Dutch Mennonites running naked through the streets in the 16th century, but more the idea of being Anabaptist without all of that cultural trapping attached to it. And so, yeah, that's been an interesting phenomenon where people who have no intention of becoming Mennonites are saying the Anabaptist tradition actually has a lot to offer Christianity today, and we ought to find ways of incorporating those ideas into our other traditions. So good, glad I got it. Yeah. Oh, definitely. Mm-hmm. Bill, I think it's also been true that in a lot of these other countries where Mennonite membership has grown, for a lot of those people, that Anabaptist story actually does resonate fairly well. For us, yeah, we've kind of gotten comfortable and, it's like, oh yeah, once upon a time that was true, but most of us don't think of it personally. In a lot of these parts of the world, they do. It is hard to be a Christian, and the Anabaptist story does provide a sort of grounding for them because there's some overlap there. Yeah. All right, I need to respect their, anyone can run off who needs to. If there's any questions, I'll wait around for those too. Otherwise, thanks.